Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 286, The People of More Books? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And before we jump into today's topic, just wanted to make a quick request for your financial support. I think now well over 100 people are supporting this work with a monthly contribution through either Patreon or you can do that directly on our website. A lot of those monthly contributions are on the small side. They're $2 or $3 or $4 or $5. We love that. That's really helpful to us. That adds up. So, 100 people giving $5 means that we can rely on $500 a month to come in, and that really helps us do our planning. So we wanted to throw out there the possibility that if you haven't already, you could sign up for one of those monthly giving plans and just hop to our website at www.judaismunbound.com/donate. And there you'll find all these ways that you can click on various things and potentially sign up for a monthly contribution of just a few dollars, right? We put out there that idea that if you contribute for $1 for each episode that you listen to, so that adds up to $4 or $5 a month. That's a great level, and we're very grateful. And I'll also mention at this point that you can do something that we haven't talked about too much for a while, which is to go on Apple Podcasts or whatever other podcast app you listen to. Please help us spread the word by putting 5-star reviews and positive comments on whatever podcast app you listen to the podcast on. So let's jump into this conversation, Lex. We're following up on the Pew study and other studies and what we're kind of learning about, whether we're even asking the right questions and what would be the questions that we would really want to ask. We actually didn't get to that last week, so maybe that's a good place to start this week, because we're also following up on that series of episodes that we've done in an interspersed kind of way over the last few months, where we've talked to authors of recent Jewish books, most of which have been fiction, a couple of which have been nonfiction. And I feel like the way that I want to think about literature is that literature is sometimes a way of focusing us on asking a set of questions that we may not normally ask in our everyday lives, and that maybe we don't want to, not everybody wants to read a statistical survey to provoke them, but sometimes you can achieve that through literature. That's kind of where my head is at right now as I think about some of the books that we've been looking at. What are you thinking about?
I want to start by saying big plug to everyone to read not just Jewish books, Jewish fiction. I also, we can talk more about books generally, nonfiction. I also think that's great. But I'll be the first to admit that until we did some of these deep dives with authors like Leah Moser of Magical Princess Harriet, with Rachel Lewis from The Rabbi Who Prayed with Fire, with we've got one amazing one coming up with Amy Lucido, Recipe for Disaster, and she was on with Sophia Pasternak in the past. Like, those books are amazing, and I would call out to everyone to check them out. But really, the action of reading Jewish fiction, I don't think I saw the importance of that to the extent I needed to until we actually had these conversations. I really don't. I have seen books like these as really nice add-ons to Jewish communal gatherings, to Jewish political organizing, to all of the things that we've featured on this show. But there's something really transformative that not only can happen in reading a book of Jewish fiction, but I think almost automatically does. I think like you can't embed yourself for many hours in a world, in a like a created world, whether that's like a speculative fiction kind of sci-fi world that's different from ours, or even if it's our own world with just a few characters that are being looked at. Like, you can't embed deeply in such a work and not be changed. I actually think that would be hard. Based on our last conversation where we talked about like representation and how certain institutions of Jewish life, like they sort of speak for a small subset of Jews, often the most institutionally connected, involved Jews, and then they claim to be representative. I want to think about works of Jewish fiction as almost voices for groups of Jews. I'm not going to say they're representative because like they'd have the same issues as institutions, right? They're not speaking for everyone, but they are speaking for some. And like I want to compare them to a JCRC, to a Jewish Community Relations Council, where like people, maybe millions, at least many thousands, have read The Chosen. And I'm not going to say millions, but maybe thousands, again, have read As a Driven Leaf. I'm picking sort of mid-20th century classics that are super Jewishly, like nobody could argue whether these are Jewish books or not. But As a Driven Leaf, for those who haven't read it, I'm not spoiling much, but like it is a deep meditation on being pulled between what we think of as deeply Jewish life and secular life. It's not set in our time. It's set with Talmudic rabbis 2,000 years ago. But it's very much about a core character who feels pulled to Greek philosophy and simultaneously pulled to Jewish philosophy, Jewish thinking, and the struggles with that. That in the mid-20th century, in a time where the defining experience of so many American Jews, my own grandparents, was this push and pull, this questioning of like how involved in Jewish distinctiveness am I? How involved in American life that's not distinctively Jewish am I? How do we navigate that? To what extent can we bridge? Do we have to make a choice? Like those were the questions. Those were the questions that like a huge percentage of the 20th century Jewish experience revolved around. And we have voices of that through not just institutions that like forged relationships with politicians or whatever to make life easier for Jews. Like that's one way that this was navigated. But another way this was navigated was by Milton Steinberg writing a book and allowing people to think, what is it to be pulled between quote unquote secular experience and Jewish experience? And the brilliance of it is that it's not set in the 20th century. It's set distant enough that it doesn't feel quite like we're talking about ourselves. But then at the end, we realize we've been thinking about ourselves the whole time. And that's what fiction not only can do, but almost automatically does, especially when it's set in alternate time periods, in alternate universes. The voices we need to be voicing are not just through constructing new institutions. Since our first episode, we've been saying that we need new Jewish institutions, and we do. But I think I've been changed because I've realized, some of what we need to do doesn't need to be edifices or even institutions without buildings. It can be literature. And that's not like really, that could have as much of an impact or even more than some of the institutions we might construct.
They really started, I think I said this on the podcast way back when, but it started with my telling my sister that I wish that there was a story that talked about the northern kingdom of Israel in a really positive way, because then we would have an alternative version of Judaism that we could say we're part of. As opposed to the only way that you can really understand that kind of stuff now is to read nonfiction by academic biblical scholars. And I actually think some of those books are really great, but it's not for everyone. And if you have
and sorry to interrupt, but for me, the important thing is that you didn't start Jews for the Northern Kingdom. Like you didn't go and start a project, like an organization, a club. And I think that's how we've been trained to think about doing this.
Yeah, I think that's right. Except that I'll tell you, like one of the reasons why I didn't start Jews for the Northern Kingdom was because I think fundamentally that you can't, and I shouldn't say you can't. I mean, I think it's difficult to get people moving in a certain direction without stories that they build that direction upon. And that there's a paucity of stories, and that I don't only mean, fiction books, but Yuval Noah Harari's book Sapiens is very interesting about other kinds of stories. Like he talks about money as being a story. Like it's not, money isn't a real thing. It's we believe that it has meaning and therefore it has meaning, et cetera. And that you kind of build society on these stories. And then there's also more explicit stories like the Bible or a novel. And, I kind of do want to create this Jews from the Northern Kingdom, or this version of Judaism that looks at the Northern Kingdom as a paradigm. You couldn't really do that in a world of most of the Jews who haven't never heard of the Northern Kingdom or only vaguely heard of it. So we have to have stories that really allow you to sort of get some depth and understanding of what that might mean. And so I had that conversation with my sister, and she said, "Oh, there actually is this book, Yochi Brandis's book, Malachim Gimel, which ended up being translated as The Secret Book of Kings." I learned a lot in that project, including that the book business is a really tough business these days. And it actually makes me think about the nonprofit world as well, right? I mean, we sort of have an expectation, I think a lot of us, that people write novels and their hope is to make a lot of money, and they don't all make a lot of money, but some of them break through and make a lot of money. And that's where the motivation to write comes from and should come from. And we sort of have it in this like capitalism bucket. And where we think about Judaism and the practice of Judaism, we have it in this nonprofit bucket where we say, oh, well, of course, that's going to require philanthropy and other kinds of models in order to get that to happen. And for the most part, we feel comfortable with that as a community. I can tell you, even working with a world-renowned author and a highly selling author in another country, that the Jewish book business in America is not a huge moneymaker. And so the question becomes, if we're going to take seriously what you're saying, that writing a book and having a book, by the way, isn't this the very basis of Judaism? That having a book is at the center of a way to live your life? That if we want to expand that and have more books, right, we're going to probably have to place the production of books and other art in the same category as organization building.
I'm struck by a number of things. So first, there's the piece about Jews for the Northern Kingdom and whether there should be a club or not. I really want to push on the idea of even Jews for the Northern Kingdom as like the end goal, and where like you would like to construct that club, and so you needed to have stories in order to get there, because how else would you have a group of people that care about the Northern Kingdom if you don't have collective stories that people have read? I hear descriptively that's true. Prescriptively, I guess I have some like diva in me or whatever. Like I recoil at the idea that books exist as the means towards human communities. There's something really that hits me deep with that I'm learning about myself. And I know that you don't quite mean that. Like you don't mean that the only purpose of a book is to get people to form a club around it. But if somebody were to think that, I think that's what leads us to write off books, because I think it's very exceedingly rare that books achieve that. And so if their purpose is to mobilize communities of people together, I get why people wouldn't invest in that, because I don't know that it works. Like if I were talking to a funder, I don't know that I could seriously make that argument. If the question is on an individual level, which Jewish communal funders don't love. That ties to stuff we talked about last time. We're very collectively minded about bringing people together in rooms, doing things together. But there's a way in which books, as a direct to individual transformative practice, is as effective or more effective than almost anything. If I were to think about all people I know across a ton of different axes of difference, and I were to try and think about something like a genre of thing, a realm of thing that all of those people have been transformed by, I think almost everybody, and this is why literacy is important, right? Like people who are literate, almost all of those people have been transformed by reading something alone, themselves, not in community with others. Maybe sometimes it's been added to because they've been able to share it with others. But in the process of constructing new Jewish futures that will involve communities gathering together and building whatever, institutions or some pseudo institutions, the bang for your buck of like reading 300 pages over the course of a few days, and the amount that is likely to at least potentially change somebody's approach to Judaism, that feels like the hugest bang for your buck. There's a lot of people who can point to, oh, I was a kid in middle school and we were assigned Number the Stars, a Holocaust-related book, and I felt seen. I felt for the first time visible in my English class. Oh, we could go down the list of all these books of different levels of Jewishness, different levels of like popularity beyond just Jewish communities, that stuff is huge. And so for us to treat it, and I know you didn't really mean it this way, but I'm just speaking to like listeners or to anybody out there, like for us to see it only as precursor to gathering people, I think misses the extent to which even touching people each individually through art can play a massive role in transforming the world.
I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of the capacity to touch an individual person and to change the way an individual person thinks. And then I think the question is, how do we judge the importance of whether a person's thinking is changed? In the sense, and I say that in the sense that, like I've said many times, that reading Richard Elliott Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible, is what changed me. And as a result of that, this podcast exists. You know, various balls hit other balls, you know, and this podcast exists. So if you like this podcast, you can thank one particular book for it. I'm pretty sure this podcast would not exist but for that book. I'll share with you like another way that I kind of look at it. It's both from The Secret Book of Kings and also from Who Wrote the Bible, right? There's this idea that if we think about the northern kingdom of Israel versus the southern kingdom of Judah, right? Judaism comes from Judah. I mean, that's the reason for the name Judaism. But for example, what we know from history is that the Levites were the priests of the northern kingdom. My name is Liebenson. It probably has nothing to do with Levite in its origin, except that we have some family lore that it does. But when I started to read about the northern kingdom, and I was like, oh, this is really kind of a cool alternate version of Judaism. And then I started to think, oh, well, I'm a Levite, so maybe, you know, my people were the priests of that other form of Judaism. And I've been, you know, stuck for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, 2,500 years in this world that almost like my family got stuck in. You know, they were refugees and they didn't really want to come to the Southern Kingdom, but they had to. And, you know, you can spin out this whole fantasy where like I'm actually descended from this other group. There's something empowering about it. And I think that goes in both directions, right? One is that if I feel empowered, if I'm sort of a dissident of some kind, right? If I'm out of step with the world as I'm experiencing it, but I have a book that somehow allows me to place myself in a different story that allows me to function in the world in a place where I kind of feel like more supported, more affirmed. That in itself is of great value just in terms of my own capacity to go through the world happier and less angry. In addition to that, though, if it turns out that there are a lot of people who find that same kind of experience through reading that book, then I feel excited about the possibility that I could band together with those people and actually create something together. And I think like that connects to the Pew study stuff that we were talking about last week. It's like there's this silent majority of Jews, right, who are not connected to Jewish institutional life. And all of them have kind of been taught to say, hey, this is the real Judaism, and I'm not connected to it. I'm a bad Jew. I'm a not interested Jew. Whatever kind of Jew I am, I'm not the, quote, right kind of Jew. And I may know that there are other people who are not connected, but I kind of feel like they're not connected for different reasons. But if it turns out that some book catches fire that we all read and we say, hey, this actually captures me. And I think about Amy Lucido's book, Recipe for Disaster, as possibly something like that, where a lot of people, I think, could read that book, kids and adults, could read that book and say, wow, that's just like me. Then they could sort of find each other and say, hey, we've been told implicitly or explicitly all along that we're like the bad kind of Jew, but it turns out that we're just another kind of Jew. We should band together and do something together. I could imagine that. And I think that a book may be uniquely powerful in doing that precisely because of what you're identifying, that it gives you a one-on-one experience. Like you have to have that experience with the book as an individual. But then if you can realize that many other one-on-ones have had the same experience with that book, you then suddenly have a point of connection with a lot of people that you don't have to establish with each one-on-one.
I think there's a lot of people out there who actually have entire Jewish journey stories. They could walk you through decades of their lived experience and transformations through reading books tied to Jewish experience. Whether that's like quote unquote Jewish fiction that like thinks of itself as that, or if it's books that reach a secular audience but revolve around Jews. I mentioned Michael Chabon before, like The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, the Yiddish Policeman's Union. I mean, Yiddish Policeman's Union has Yiddish in the title, so I think people think of it as automatically a little more Jewish. That's a whole interesting. But like Cavalier and Clay, wow, what a meditation on so many different elements of Jewish experience, immigration, and the things we talked about with Abe Reisman and comic. I mean, 100 threads collide in this deep way. And like, if somebody were to ask me, like, how could I connect to Judaism in a few days? I think most people asked that question would be like, oh, here are the synagogues and JCCs and whatever in your community. Go to them, see what's going on. And I'm not here to say that's a bad answer, but a no less good answer is like, here's your book list. You're going to dive into these for the next few days, and you're going to emerge really with a connection to, with an understanding of, with a relationship with different pieces of Jewish experience. That's the key. Like the relationship piece is huge because it's something magical about human brains where like, I don't really distinguish between the relationship I have with fictional characters in books I love and the relationship I have with people that actually exist. I'm not saying that's cynically. I'm saying that positively. Like, this is why people cry when fictional characters die. And that's good. So the chance to just literally know that in immersing in a few hours into a text, ideally a good one, but even if it's a bad one, like reading a bad Jewish book, it's similar to like going to a terrible synagogue service. Like you come away with ideas of what would make it better, what didn't work for you. And so that's number one, is I think we should do more of that. We should like it's not that I want everybody to peer pressure each other, but we should like, have you heard the good news of Jewish literature? Like really read this. Like what if synagogue folks were giving sermons about, don't come next week. We're not going to have Shabbat services. Everybody in our community is going to read a book of their choice that ties to, whether it's something Jewish or even something not directly Jewish that speaks to how we understand Judaism, something interdisciplinary. I don't know. I don't anticipate that happening because I think we still have this understanding that the core, Shabbat, holidays, liturgy, God, Israel, like that's the core. I look at that, to go back to the Pew study, like we promised our listeners we'd do more with the Pew study. I look at a section of it that looks at sort of practices, different kinds of cultural religious practices that Jews do and don't do. Fourth on the list out of 12 is 44% of Jewish Americans answer in the affirmative that they read Jewish literature. That's huge. And you could look at the survey to go the Tema Smith angle. That is higher than the number of Jews who say they connect to Shabbat in a meaningful way. That's higher. And so you could make the headline the doomsday scenario. Oh my gosh, fewer Jews care about Shabbat than reading Jewish books. How terrible. It's like the pets thing from last week. Like, oh, how terrible that people care less about X, Y, or Z than they care about their pets. Or you could say, wow, almost half of Jews indicate that they have a serious relationship with Jewish fiction. How do we run with that? How, like, if that's more popular than Shabbat, we could do the game of like, oh, we got to advocate for Shabbat. We got to get more people doing Shabbat. And it's not even just services. We're going to think expansively. We need more people to do Shabbat in a meaningful way at home. And we need people to be creative with it. Like, I want to do all that. I love Shabbat. I do. And I'll be the first to say, like, it pains me to say that Shabbat might not be that popular, even in an expansive definition of what Shabbat is. It hurts deeply that that's the case. I think it's a magical ritual. But given that it is, and given that Jewish literature is higher on that list and I see immense potential there, okay, let's make a huge communal investment and co-construction, co-creation of communities and experiences and whatever that are around Jewish books. Let's do it.
But maybe what I have to say is connected to both Shabbat and Jewish literature, because when I look at the Pew study for the different questions that are asked there, I kind of think about like what a miracle it is that such a high number of people either do mark Shabbat in some way or read Jewish literature or any of these things that are not really presented to them in an active way as a Jewish thing to do. In other words, Shabbat is presented to people as a Jewish thing to do, but not generally the way that they are marking Shabbat. And it just always makes me think, like, what if we made it easier for people to access these things and to have them as part of their life. So let me give you an example from my life. I love reading. I love books. I always have. But for some reason, I started to find it really difficult to read a full book and just to sit down and read. And if audiobooks were not invented, I shudder to think about how many fewer books I would have read over the last 20 years than I did. And I think that there could be even more Jews that read Jewish literature as an active part of their Jewish life if the Jewish literature were more easily available to them. And by the way, then the typical thing that would happen, I think, in the Jewish community would be like somebody would say, oh, yeah, we need to produce more audiobooks, so let's do it on the cheap and, get some random people reading it and whatnot, as opposed to what the real big audiobook companies do, which is that they hire actors to read the books and they read them very well. And so they're much more compelling. And by the way, that's not only true of fiction. I think that's just as true of nonfiction. I think a lot of nonfiction Jewish books would be more consumed, more easy to consume, more exciting to consume in the form of audiobooks than, realistically, as somebody going to sit down with a 500-page history of some Jewish thing, but they would be much more likely to listen to it as an audiobook, particularly anybody that's listening to this podcast. I assume that to some extent you like that approach to reading or to consuming information. Now, my point here is not about audiobooks per se. It's about making books and also other Jewish experiences more accessible through trying to figure out why is it that people are not accessing them. And this is where I go back to the subject matter of books, in particular thinking about Amy Lucido's book, Recipe for Disaster, which we both love so much. And we're going to have another conversation with her in a few weeks, closer to the publication date of that book, where we'll do a deep dive into it. But part of what makes it compelling is that it's about a Jewish character who is struggling with the question of whether she's really Jewish or whether she's Jewish enough or Jewish in the right way. And there are other characters in the story that have questions of that nature or analogous questions. And I think that makes this book accessible to a certain set of readers in a way that you could say, physically, is it more accessible? No, of course. They're both, this book and that book are both in English. They're both the same number of pages. They're both available or not available as audiobooks. By the way, Amy's book is available as an audiobook, or will be.
Nice plug.
But to some extent, it's saying, okay, well, what makes a book accessible? What makes anything accessible is that it is something that I can interface with it as a starting point based on where I currently am and where this thing that I'm interfacing with currently is. So this book has to have at least enough to draw me in, right? It has to have a hook when the story starts. It has to have characters that I can relate to. All those things that anybody who creates popular art understands, that you have to worry about that initial point of interface. And then as I draw you in, I can pull you towards more and more serious questions. And so the whole question of how a book is constructed, a work of fiction is constructed, I think is also very relevant to how we interact with other kinds of Jewish experiences that are not any kind of a book.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what's a book and what's not a book now, to get real up in the clouds as we do. Torah is Jewish literature, right? I'm not saying that to be interesting. The 5 books of Moses is an example of Jewish literature. The rest of the Tanakh, the rest of the Hebrew Bible is Jewish literature. And I say that not because I'm here to say super obvious things, but because I think we draw this big distinction between the set of Jewish literature things that we read in synagogue, whether on a weekly cycle for the Torah or or at an allotted time of the year, like Esther on Purim or Lamentations on the 9th of Av or whatever. Somehow those are a different thing. I'm including myself in this, from books available on the shelf at Barnes & Noble that are deep and tied to Jewish stuff. And I want to make the claim that Jewish literature is just Torah before a few hundred years have passed. The only difference between Esther and, the books that we've interviewed people about recently is that it's been a few thousand years. Esther is a great. I'm not diminishing Esther, by the way. I'm only elevating the other book. Esther, I think, is a terrific piece of Jewish literature. It's also catastrophic and, there's deeply violent and harmful if you interpret it certain ways. But it's a really good story, and it's thoughtfully put together. It's a great satire. It's a good work of fiction. And it was so good as a work of Jewish literature that a bunch of people were like, oh, we should have a time every year where we read this. I think that's why there's a holiday of Purim, more than the fact that in the book of Esther it says, there's this thing, Purim, with a few commandments. Like, if you want to preserve a story, you put a day of the year associated with the story, and then you tell it. Same with Lamentations, this beautiful acrostic poem that is tragic and awful and tough to read, but like the most evocative, painful book you could ever ask for. That's in because, it spoke to a lot of people, and they decided to make sure it got in the canon. Like the Torah and the prophets, those books are in the canon because they're like sort of telling it's not quite one long story. We've unpacked that in the past. But there is a way in which the Torah, through Joshua and Judges and Kings and Samuel, all of those, it's telling sort of the story of the Jewish people, of the Israelites and the Judahites, but like that group. The books and the writings, there's not like a reason for them to be there. They're just really good. They're just really great stories. And so we threw them in because people connected to them, and it would just be so sad to lose those. It would be so sad. So I feel the same way about stuff today, but somehow we've lost the muscle of being able, that we can't flex anymore, of just being like, this, Diary of Anne Frank, to choose like maybe the most well-known Jewish book in recent memory. Like somehow that's still, after almost 100 years, it's a status different and lower than what we've in the Torah, in Tanakh, etc. Why? This goes back to all of our conversations about canon and also like the difference between treating stuff as midrash, as like new takes on Torah as opposed to Torah itself. Like we should just say, okay, Diary of Anne Frank is a sacred Jewish text. We should have a time every year where we connect to it. By the way, maybe that's a bad example because of the mood and content of Diary of Anne Frank. I do think it's important, but other books that we think are super central, like let's read them in synagogue. I want us to consider, what if any particular Jewish book we're reading right now, what if in a few hundred years it were seen as having canonical status and read regularly, not just from a place of interest, but from a place of like religion even? How would that affect what we're reading? And how would we take what the characters are voicing and their concerns and their struggles? Like, how would we take that seriously?
One of the reasons why the books of the Bible as we have them, why we have them is because like there wasn't all that many books back then. But now if you think about how many books there are, how would you choose which go into the canon? It would be a much more complex set of choices. Or would there be multiple canons, so to speak? In other words, and maybe individualized, right? I think each of us has a canon of books that is particularly significant in shaping our lives. I think it's interesting to call each of those a Torah. And then you think about like, well, if I wanted to, going back to this question that you had about looking at literature as either something that is just for me, right, just for individuals, that just changes lives, versus something that I want to use as a way to create community around it or to change many lives in a similar way, then I might have to do an inventory of the books that really matter to me and ask myself, if I'm going to provide somebody else with books that I think they should read, you don't offer somebody 1,000 books, a list of 1,000 books. You offer them 5 books or something like that. How do you decide which 5 those are going to be? At that point, in a sense, you're writing a book of your own. You're creating a new story of your own. And then I think back to the Bible and I think about like Genesis in a way that I haven't really thought of it before. That the function of Genesis is to hook you into reading the rest of the Bible. That's it.
I firmly agree with that, by the way.
Like, I just want to know what happens to these people. Like, what happens to, I also think about there's a genre of literature, like, for example, science fiction. Like, I'm thinking of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which I think about a lot, but there's going to be an Apple TV Plus show of it coming up in a few months. And that is a story that takes place over like 1,000 years. So the characters don't stay the same throughout the book and certainly throughout the trilogy. You care about this character that you've just been introduced to halfway through the second book or whatever, because you understand that this character is playing out a story that was put into motion by the guy who you did care about at the very beginning, Harry Seldon. That ball went into motion, and now you're following it along over the course of 1,000 years. In many ways, that's like the Bible. I mean, this is, by the way, why I thought it would be interesting to think about genres of literature that we have, historical fiction, which is kind of like a story that purports to take place in the past. We have, fantasy or science fiction or some kind of speculative type of story that is not something that we've experienced yet, but it takes place in the future, an alternative reality. And then we have books, again, like Amy Lucido's book, Recipe for Disaster, that kind of take place in our time with people like us or people that we know. And I wonder if, A, those genres of literature sort of matter. Like, should we be saying, hey, this is really a time where we should be emphasizing speculative Jewish science fiction because we really need to be thinking about alternative futures? Or what we really need is historical fiction because we need to have stories that legitimate alternative ways of thinking. That was what I was trying to do with The Secret Book of Kings. Or do we really need these contemporary stories that we can map onto best because they're characters that are like us? Or is the answer that we need a whole new library of a mixture of set of genres, just like the Bible is? And then, like, how do we organize that canon such that people can actually access it and sort of come into this world of exploring Judaism through literature?
I still am on largely the team of no unified canon across all Jews, but I am certainly convinced that we could advocate for certain kinds of books being more prevalent on more people's canons, like Recipe for Disaster. But like I'm going to make a weird connection, which maybe it's not that weird. We're about to be talking a lot about Shemitah, about the sabbatical year, and not only are we going to be doing so over the next few weeks leading into Rosh Hashanah, into the actual beginning of the sabbatical year, but even throughout the entire calendar year. I said calendar year. It's not a secular calendar year, but the Rosh Hashanah to the next Rosh Hashanah year. We're going to be doing regular check-ins about Shemitah from different angles. And I bring it up because I really believe in the potential for this sabbatical year to be a kind of reset on both an individual level and a societal level. Or maybe not both, maybe on all levels of individual, community, and society. And I think that we might have a great opportunity in this Shemitah year to create our own Torah cycle, Jewish literature cycle, of our own books that have been important to us, or maybe books we haven't read yet, but we have an inkling could be important to us. And I'm excited about that. I might try to make that one of my own practical steps in Shemitah. Like, it's not that I have to read a book every week. I'm wildly impressed by people who do that. Like, I have a few friends who have set a New Year's resolution some years that, like, they're going to read a book every single week. I think if you got through 3 books, that could be a profound way of spending Shemitah. And if they were books chosen with an eye on the big picture of the present and future of Judaism, if a lot of people did that, we could really see profound changes really shortly afterwards.
I think I was just stuck on this idea of the genres of literature too, because when we think about historical fiction versus contemporary fiction versus science fiction, they're actually all, I mean, this is sort of obvious, but they're all being written in the present. I mean, they're all obviously ways of trying to get at or understand the present better, or to help people think in a new way about the present, or that flows from the present. Because if it wasn't about the present, they wouldn't really be able to understand it. I haven't done like a full accounting of all historical fiction and all science fiction, but my guess is that the historical fiction and science fiction that's been most successful has been stuff that somehow mapped onto the present in which that book was written, such that people really could understand it and could relate to it, even though it was talking about something very far in the past or very far in the future. And I'm thinking about Phil Grobart's book, Planet of the Jews, and how much some of my friends love that book so much. And I think that part of why they love it is probably because there aren't that many examples of Jewish sci-fi / Jewish writing that is affirmative about comic book writing. Although, like you mentioned earlier, there's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon as well. But I think also it's because that book talks about a lot of the questions that are on people's minds in terms of what is a Jew really, and where does some of our thinking about anti-Semitism take us to strange places, etc. There could be a lot of historical fiction, a lot of science fiction that's not about the present, but my guess is that that's not the stuff that people read that much. So I go back to the economic question, though, as we move towards concluding this episode, because I think that we agree that fiction and Jewish book writing is a lot more important than maybe a lot of people think it is, or than the community, the Jewish community, has been focused on. We think that's a little strange because the Jewish community does understand that a particular work of Jewish writing, the Bible, is very important. So why do we imagine that there wouldn't be others? And then it comes down to this question of what could happen to move that insight from a realization into the production of more Jewish literature that is more self-consciously being produced in order to speak to the Jewish present, and that also connects with an audience. Because I think there are a lot of people out there, we hear from them sometimes, they send us emails. There are people out there that are working on works of Jewish literature, but they have told us that they struggle to find a publisher. So is there some other way that we could, that one could encourage the production of this kind of art, while also sort of understanding that it's not going to come together with, millions of dollars?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of ways to get at that, and for me, I'm really starting to get interested in this idea that we would embed Jewish literature in. I don't even care if it's synagogues, but I'm actually more excited about if it were small chavaras, groups of people, alt communities, queer communities. If you're right, if you're going to write a book and make money off of it, it's a really brutal, tough task. If we took this on as what if it were a rhythmic part of Jewish communities that every few weeks it's not a Devar Torah, it's not a check-in about the Torah portion, it's a Devar Sefer. Sefer is the Hebrew word for book. So it's a somebody's take on a book, or even not a Devar Sefer, like a short story. What if it were actually a thing that? And by the way, I grew up at summer camp, and we had this wonderful, lovely person. On Friday night, she would just tell a story after, we'd do Friday night services, and then there was this moment where all the counselors went inside the dining hall and had this raucous dance fest, the only moment all week where counselors are just with other counselors. It was a beautiful thing, and all the campers would stay outside. And often I remember a lot of those stories, and I think back to them, and they've got deep morals and beautiful. Some of them are Hasidic stories, some of them are just stories. We could do that in communities, and I think if it weren't, I have to write a book, because if you're writing a book, yeah, money matters. You're not going to devote a couple years of your life to writing a book for no pay. I mean, at least most people aren't. What if we had a world in which we were writing alt histories and potential speculative futures and sharing them in Jewish communities? I would do that one time. I don't think of myself as, a novelist. I would experiment with a short story and present it to a group of people. And the last piece that I'll say is, you mentioned, I think the books that talk about the present, even when they pretend to talk about the past, those are the ones that succeed, not the ones that just talk about the past. I don't think any books of historical fiction or any genre can ever not be talking about their own present. It's so funny. I remember growing up in school, we'd read all these books from the mid-20th century that were written by Americans. It was like a meme with my friends. All of them are about the Cold War. Even if they didn't think they were about the Cold War, turns out they're about the Cold War. Because everything that people wrote in the 60s and 70s in some way or another is commenting on the Cold War. Because that's the world, that's what people were inhabiting. And when scholars try to date the Bible and try to figure, they're looking at what allusions are being made to stuff that's not even the content of the text. Like, people date the Book of Jubilees by noticing there's some allusions to the Maccabees. So they know that it's shortly after some of the Maccabean revolts based on, and not because the book is like, hey, the Maccabees did X. It's because you can read in the text various assumptions being made, various groups of people being discussed or hinted to that help you anchor the text in time. Not because the author meant to, but just because every author is the product of their time and their space. So that's another strength, not a weakness, is we have all of these time capsules of different eras in Jewish history, and we get to make our own time capsules in our own time, even if we're pretending it's about the year 3000 or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a little funny that we've spent the last hour proving that the people of the book should take books more seriously, and that probably would like to. But at the end of the day, I think that the connection to last week and our conversation about the population studies really is that people have a sense of connection to Judaism, but they probably are going to need new expressions of Jewish living to connect to those impulses to want to connect to Judaism, and that some of the source material out of which those new ways to express Judaism are going to come from is the Bible and the old books, and some of it is going to be the new books. And I certainly am excited to see how all those pieces fit together.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation and this sort of mini set of conversations that was about, or at least launched from, Jewish population studies. But, you know, we said this, but we very intentionally brought it together with these conversations we've had about various fiction books over time. And by the way, we're not saying goodbye to novels. Like, we'll continue featuring authors in the future that are bringing books that we think are of value, because, like I said, we see those contributions as similar to folks starting institutions or running communal initiatives that we always talk to. Like, that's on our playing field. But for now, we're sort of turning the page, pun intended, on that situation. And we're going to a unit of conversations on the sabbatical year, on Shemitah, and considering what this once every 7-year opportunity to reset could mean as Jews, but also as humanity. So we're looking forward to that. The last thing that we always close our episodes with is that we deeply appreciate being in touch with you. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram handles. Those are all just Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. You can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, we deeply appreciate when you are able to support us financially. You can do so at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. Dan mentioned the importance that those donations hold for us just to continue doing the work we do, and especially on the monthly recurring front, even if it's just a couple dollars, that goes a long way for us. So thank you so much for listening. Let us know your thoughts. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.